We live in a world where every country, every government, and almost every individual is somehow entangled in a vast web of debt. From the richest nations to the poorest, debt has become a constant feature of modern civilization. Yet despite the universality of indebtedness, few people ever stop to ask the most fundamental question. If every nation on earth is in debt, then who exactly is everyone indebted to? This question sits at the core of the global financial system, and its answer reveals a structure more intricate and intentional than most people imagine. Modern discussions about national debt often occur in the context of elections, budget negotiations, or economic crises. Citizens hear about deficits, spending bills, debt ceilings, and government shutdowns. But these conversations distract from the deeper truth. The entire global economic system is built on debt, and not merely as a temporary state, but as a permanent condition. Global debt today exceeds $300 trillion, a number so large it defies comprehension. It grows every year, regardless of political changes, domestic reforms, or ideological shifts. Debt is not something nations accumulate by mistake. It is something they are expected to carry indefinitely. Most people assume that debt is simply a loan that must eventually be paid back. We are taught that responsible households or businesses reduce their debt over time. Yet for governments, the opposite happens. National debts almost never decrease in a meaningful way. Instead, they grow continuously, generation after generation. Children are born already burdened with obligations created by decisions made decades before their birth. This raises an unsettling question. Is this accumulation a failure of responsible governance? Or could it be that the system is designed to ensure debt persists forever? When we examine debt more closely, we begin to see that it is less a temporary burden and more a mechanism of control. Debt dictates policy. Debt determines what governments can or cannot do. Debt influences tax rates, public services, military spending, and even foreign relations. A heavily indebted country cannot easily defy financial markets, international institutions, or powerful creditors. It is constrained in ways that limit real sovereignty. In this sense, debt becomes a kind of invisible governance, one not chosen by voters, but imposed by financial necessity. At the same time, the widespread nature of debt obscures its beneficiaries. If all countries owe money, who sits on the receiving end? The answer is not a single nation or institution, but rather a class of creditors composed of central banks, private financial institutions, investment funds, and wealthy bondholders. These entities do not merely lend money. They profit from the long-term cycle of interest payments that flow upward from taxpayers to creditors. For them, the continuation of debt is not a problem. It is the foundation of their wealth. This is why global debt keeps rising. The system works best when debt is permanent. Governments borrow not just to fund emergencies or wars, but to sustain ordinary operations. They refinance old debt with new debt. They rely on central banks to maintain liquidity in the financial system, ensuring that borrowing never stops. The design of modern finance encourages governments to take on more debt, not less. It creates a world where paying off national debt entirely is nearly impossible. Another paradox adds to this complexity. Debt is not merely owed, it also creates money. When governments issue bonds, when banks create loans, or when central banks expand balance sheets, new money enters circulation. Without debt, the modern monetary system would collapse. Debt is not just a financial instrument. It is the engine that creates currency itself. In other words, the world is structured so that money originates from debt, and therefore the elimination of debt would mean the destruction of money. This makes the system almost impossible to escape. Governments cannot pay off their debt because the money required to do so would have to come from further debt creation elsewhere in the system. If debt were significantly reduced worldwide, the money supply would shrink dramatically, leading to economic collapse. Thus, nations are locked in a perpetual cycle: borrow, repay interest, borrow again, refinance, and repeat indefinitely. For ordinary citizens, the implications are profound. People pay taxes not only for public services, but also to finance the interest that governments owe to creditors. A portion of every tax payment ultimately flows upward into the hands of those who hold government bonds. In this way, debt becomes a mechanism for transferring wealth from the general population to financial elites. The more debt a government carries, the more of its future revenue is already spoken for. Understanding this reality is the first step in recognizing that the system operates according to a design, one that favors those who lend over those who borrow, one that ensures the perpetuity of debt, and one that subtly shifts power away from democratic institutions toward financial structures that are neither elected nor accountable to the public. This is the foundation of the argument explored in this series that the global debt system was not an accident of history, but the deliberate construction of individuals and institutions with the foresight to understand how debt could shape entire nations. The birth of perpetual government debt. The Bank of England. To understand how the world became locked into an inescapable debt system, we must travel back to the late 17th century. This is where one of the most important yet overlooked financial inventions in history was created: perpetual government debt. While kings and states had borrowed money long before, it was not until 1694, with the establishment of the Bank of England, that national debt became an institutional, permanent, and strategically engineered system. England of the late 1600s was a nation in crisis. Decades of war, political instability, and economic mismanagement had left the crown nearly bankrupt. The government desperately needed funds to continue its military campaigns, particularly against France. The crown's reputation for defaulting on loans made it nearly impossible to raise money through the usual channels. It was in this atmosphere of financial desperation that a man named William Paterson proposed a radical idea, one that would reshape the world. Paterson's proposal was both simple and revolutionary. A group of private investors would lend £1.2 million to the government. In return, the government would grant them a royal charter to form a corporation, the Bank of England, and give them the right to issue banknotes backed by government debt. But the most transformative part of the proposal was this: the loan would not be repaid in the traditional sense. Instead, the government would agree to pay interest indefinitely, creating a permanent revenue stream for the bank's owners. This arrangement was unlike anything before. Historically, sovereign debt was understood as a temporary burden that a government would eventually extinguish. But the Bank of England Charter effectively declared that national debt could be perpetual. The principal would remain outstanding forever, and the state would continuously service the interest through taxation. This created a new kind of relationship between governments and financiers, a relationship based not on temporary loans, but on long-term dependence. This innovation set a precedent that other nations soon adopted. The idea of perpetual government debt was attractive because it gave governments access to large sums of money, without the expectation that they must ever fully repay it. At the same time, it made government bonds some of the most secure and attractive investments for wealthy individuals and institutions. They were backed by the power of taxation, the ability of the state to extract revenue from its population. This new model had profound consequences. First, it shifted financial power away from monarchs and toward private investors. The Bank of England was not a government institution in the modern sense. It was a private corporation that held extraordinary influence over the nation's finances. The government, in effect, became a long-term financial client of the bank's owners. The state now served not only its citizens, but also its creditors. Second, the creation of perpetual debt blurred the boundary between public and private finance. Government borrowing became inseparable from financial markets. War, infrastructure, colonial expansion, and domestic administration increasingly depended on bond issuance, and bondholders gained enormous leverage as a result. A government that relied on perpetual borrowing could not afford to alienate its creditors. In this way, debt became a form of political influence. Third, perpetual government debt helped transform money itself. Banknotes issued by the Bank of England were backed not by physical gold alone, but by government bonds, effectively meaning that money became debt. This laid the foundation for modern fiat currency systems, where money and debt are intertwined to the point of being indistinguishable. The more the government borrowed, the more money the financial system could create. Debt was no longer merely a financial obligation. It became the engine of monetary expansion. The long-term implications of this architecture were immense. Governments gained the ability to wage longer and more expensive wars because they could finance them through bond issuance. Empires expanded on the back of borrowed money. The financial class that emerged from this system accumulated vast influence, as they were the ones who funded nations. And the ordinary population, through taxation, became the ultimate guarantors of perpetual debt. It is crucial to understand that this system was not simply a response to a temporary crisis. It became a model, one that proved so effective for raising capital and consolidating financial power that it was copied across Europe and eventually around the world. Countries that wished to compete militarily or economically had little choice but to adopt similar structures. In this way, perpetual debt became an integral component of the global economic order. What began as a creative solution to government insolvency became the bedrock of modern finance. The Bank of England's founding marked the moment when debt ceased to be exceptional and became permanent. When the state entered into an enduring partnership with private financial power, and when the foundations of the contemporary debt-based economy were laid, every major economic institution that followed, central banks, bond markets, international lenders, would build upon this model. The perpetual debt system was not created by accident, it was designed. And it is from this design that the modern world inherited a financial structure from which escape is nearly impossible. The transformation of sovereign debt into a global wealth-generating system, Rothschild bond markets, and the rise of international by the early 19th century, Europe had adopted the model of perpetual national debt pioneered by the Bank of England. Yet this system was still largely domestic. Governments borrowed from local financiers. Debts were funded mostly through regional networks. It was not until the emergence of Nathan Rothschild, one of the most influential financiers in history, that sovereign debt evolved into a globalized mechanism for wealth creation, profit extraction, and geopolitical power. Nathan Rothschild's innovations reshaped the financial world in ways still felt today. He understood earlier than anyone that the real power of government debt was not simply in lending money to nations, but in turning that debt into a tradable commodity. Rather than acting as a mere lender, Rothschild helped create a system in which government bonds, standardized certificates of indebtedness, could be bought, sold, and traded on open markets. This transformed sovereign debt into a liquid, profitable, and highly attractive asset for wealthy investors. This development had three profound consequences. First, it created a global investor class with a direct financial interest in the stability and policies of governments. When a nation issued bonds, its fiscal health became intertwined with the fortunes of investors around the world. Governments were no longer accountable only to their citizens. They were accountable to their creditors. A nation that angered or spooked bond markets could face higher borrowing costs, lower credit ratings, or even economic isolation. This effectively gave financial elites a form of indirect political influence. Second, the rise of global bond markets made default, the refusal or inability to repay debt, far more difficult. In earlier eras, monarchs could default without catastrophic consequences because their creditors were few and local. But once government bonds were widely traded, a default would ripple across borders, bankrupting investors, threatening banks, and undermining currency stability. As a result, governments were pressured to avoid default at all costs, even if it meant raising taxes, cutting public services, or borrowing even more. This dynamic entrenched perpetual debt as a structural feature rather than a temporary condition. Third, Rothschild's innovations accelerated the integration of global financial markets. Sovereign bonds from Britain, France, Prussia, and other European powers were traded on exchanges from London to Vienna. Wealthy investors no longer tied their fortunes to a single nation. They diversified across governments, treating countries like entities in a global portfolio. This shift marked the birth of international finance, in which money flowed across borders to influence wars, revolutions, infrastructure projects, and political outcomes. In this new world, debt became not only a financial tool, but a geopolitical weapon. Nations that needed financing for wars or expansions often relied on bankers. In the Napoleonic Wars, for example, Rothschild's network played a pivotal role in financing Britain's military campaigns. By enabling governments to borrow enormous sums quickly, financiers became indispensable to statecraft. And because governments often needed refinancing after wars, perpetual debt ensured ongoing dependency. This dependency created an enduring power dynamic. Governments could raise capital, but only by promising future revenue taxation to creditors. Investors gained a steady stream of interest, backed by the coercive power of the state. The public shouldered the burden through taxes, inflation, or austerity. Wealth concentrated in the hands of those controlling capital rather than those contributing labor. Thus, debt became a system of upward wealth transfer, enriching bondholders at the expense of national populations. Every citizen, whether aware or not, became a participant in this system simply by living under a government that issued debt. As the 19th century progressed, global bond markets expanded, financial institutions strengthened, and governments increasingly relied on borrowing. What had begun as a financial innovation became a permanent structure. The world had entered an era in which nations were perpetually indebted, and in which those debts formed the backbone of international finance. This transformation laid the foundation for the next stage of the debt system, the creation of central banks, which would institutionalize permanent borrowing and make sovereign debt the anchor of modern monetary systems. It is this step, the birth of the Federal Reserve and similar institutions, that would solidify debt not just as an economic tool, but as the governing principle of the modern world. The Federal Reserve and the institutionalization of endless government borrowing by the early 20th century. The perpetual debt model was fully established in Europe. The United States, however, lacked a central institution capable of managing government borrowing and controlling the money supply. This changed with one of the most consequential and secretive meetings in financial history, the 1910 Jekyll Island Conference, where the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System was drafted. The American financial system at the time was chaotic. Banking panics occurred frequently, and the money supply fluctuated wildly. These conditions created both fear and opportunity. Wall Street bankers, especially those linked to J.P. Morgan, sought a centralized authority that could stabilize markets, guarantee liquidity, and manage government borrowing. Politicians wanted to prevent future financial crises. Though their motivations differed, both groups desired a new national institution. On Jekyll Island, a small group of bankers and policymakers met under strict secrecy. They presented themselves as a duck-hunting party to avoid press scrutiny. Over 10 days, they drafted the plan for a central bank that would be privately controlled yet publicly sanctioned. A hybrid structure ensuring that financial elites retained influence over national monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 established the Fed as the central bank of the United States. Its powers included issuing currency, regulating banks, managing interest rates, controlling liquidity, and most critically, purchasing government bonds. This last power fundamentally changed the debt landscape. With the Federal Reserve in place, the U.S. government could now borrow virtually without limit. When the government issued bonds, the Fed could buy them, injecting money into the economy. This system allowed borrowing to continue indefinitely whenever funds were needed. More bonds could be issued, and more money could be created to purchase them. Debt ceased to be a temporary measure and became the lifeblood of the financial system. This model had several transformative effects. Government debt became the foundation of the money supply. Fed-held bonds backed the creation of new currency, rooting the dollar in debt rather than gold. Borrowing became routine and politically convenient. Instead of raising taxes, governments financed programs, wars, and deficits by issuing bonds. Financial institutions gained immense power as they profited from government securities and influenced monetary policy. The economy became dependent on perpetual debt. Since contraction of public borrowing would reduce money supply and trigger recession, this system proved especially powerful during World War I and World War II, when U.S. borrowing skyrocketed. The Federal Reserve absorbed massive amounts of government debt, allowing the country to finance military mobilization on an unprecedented scale. After the wars, instead of reducing debt, the government normalized continuous deficit spending. By the late 20th century, the Federal Reserve had become the central pillar of global finance. Its policies, from interest rate decisions to bond-buying programs, affected not only the U.S. economy but markets. Worldwide, the U.S. dollar, backed by the world's largest government bond market, became the globe's reserve currency. The perpetual debt model had matured. National debts no longer needed to be repaid. They only needed to be serviced. The system demanded constant growth in debt to maintain liquidity, growth, and market stability. A world where governments ran budget surpluses and paid off their debt would threaten the entire economic order. In this way, central banking did not merely facilitate borrowing, it institutionalized it. Debt became structural, not optional. The world entered a financial architecture in which escape was no longer possible. The Global South and the International Debt Trap, IMF structural adjustment, and perpetual dependency. By the mid-20th century, perpetual debt had become a core feature of wealthy nations. But the global system expanded further through the rise of international financial institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. What began as post-war institutions intended to support development and stability evolved into mechanisms that locked many developing nations into cycles of unending debt dependency. In the 1970s and 1980s, many developing countries borrowed heavily to modernize their economies, build infrastructure, or stabilize budgets. These loans were often denominated in dollars and tied to variable interest rates. When U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates dramatically in the early 1980s to combat inflation, global borrowing costs surged. Developing nations suddenly found themselves unable to repay their debts. This crisis provided an opportunity for the IMF to step in as a global lender of last resort. But IMF loans came with strict conditionalities, known as Structural Adjustment Programs, SAPs. These conditions required countries to implement sweeping economic reforms. Privatization of state industries, elimination of subsidies, public sector layoffs, cuts to education, healthcare, and social services. Currency devaluation, opening domestic markets to foreign corporations. The stated goal was to stabilize economies, but the effect was often the opposite. Currencies collapsed, local industries were destroyed by foreign competition, and millions were pushed into poverty. Meanwhile, governments still owed interest on their original debts and often needed new IMF loans to meet their obligations. This cycle entrenched dependency. The result was a form of financial neocolonialism. Nations that had gained political independence could now be controlled economically. Instead of using military force, powerful countries and financial institutions exercised influence through debt. Developing nations were trapped. They borrowed to survive. They implemented austerity to qualify for new loans. Austerity undermined growth. Lack of growth made repayment impossible, or borrowing became necessary. This loop created a global hierarchy in which wealth flowed from poorer countries to rich financial centers. Developing nations paid billions each year in interest alone, often exceeding what they spent on healthcare or education. Their natural resources, public assets, and economic sovereignty became collateral in a system designed to extract value indefinitely. The richest countries benefited twice. Their corporations gained access to foreign markets and resources at favorable terms forced by IMF conditions. Their financial institutions profited from bond payments, interest, and loan fees. Meanwhile, the populations of indebted countries bore the brunt of austerity measures. The perpetual debt system had gone global. It no longer trapped only the citizens of wealthy countries through taxation. It trapped entire nations through international financial governance. Sovereignty became conditional. Independence became symbolic. Debt became destiny. The Great Wealth Transfer. Why the debt system cannot be escaped. Having traced the evolution of perpetual debt from 1694 to the present, we can now understand the system's true nature. It is not designed to be repaid. It is designed to persist. The modern global economy is built on a foundation of debt so vast that its elimination would collapse financial markets, banking systems, and national economies. Today, government debt is the most important asset in global finance. Banks use it as collateral. Pension funds invest in it. Central banks rely on it to regulate money supply. Corporations hedge against it. If major nations paid off their debts, the world would lose the instruments that stabilize currency, store wealth, and anchor financial markets. In other words, the system requires debt to exist. This leads to an extraordinary paradox. If debt were eliminated, money itself would evaporate. Modern money is created through borrowing. When governments issue bonds, when banks issue loans, and when central banks expand their balance sheets, new money is created. If debts were repaid and extinguished, the money supply would contract catastrophically. Economies would collapse into deflation, unemployment, and mass insolvency. Thus, Perpetual debt is not only expected, it is necessary. This necessity creates a permanent wealth transfer mechanism. Governments pay interest to creditors. These payments ultimately come from taxation, meaning citizens' labor is continually funneled upward to those who own the debt. The wealth gap widens not because of chance, but because the system allocates power to creditors and obligations to everyone else. Meanwhile, political leaders have almost no incentive to stop borrowing. Paying off debt would require extreme austerity, economic contraction, and political suicide. Borrowing, on the other hand, allows politicians to fund programs, win votes, and postpone consequences. The system rewards short-term thinking and punishes long-term responsibility. Thus, the perpetual debt structure persists across political parties, economic ideologies, national borders, generations. It does not matter who is in office. The debt must grow. It does not matter what promises are made. The interest must be paid. It does not matter how productive societies become. The system ensures that wealth flows into the financial sector. This is why the video argues that we live in a system you cannot escape. Individuals are born into it. Governments depend on it. Corporations profit from it. Financial institutions control it. The architecture was built intentionally layer by layer. Over centuries, Perpetual National Debt Bank of England, global bond markets, Rothschild system. Central banking, Federal Reserve, international debt governance, IMF, World Bank. Each stage reinforced the previous one, creating an interlocking matrix in which debt is the organizing principle of economic life. Debt dictates policy. Debt directs wealth. Debt shapes geopolitics. Most importantly, debt defines freedom. A government in debt is not free. A nation dependent on foreign loans is not sovereign. A citizen paying taxes to service interest payments is not financially autonomous. The system works because it is invisible, normalized, and unquestioned. People assume national debt is natural. They assume borrowing is necessary. They assume nothing else is possible. But the historical record shows clearly the system was designed, and those who designed it understood exactly what they were building. The global debt architecture is not a malfunction. It is not broken. It is functioning exactly as intended. That is why, as the video concludes, escape is not a matter of reform, or election, or ideology. It would require dismantling the foundations of the modern financial world, a task no institution, nation, or political movement has the power to achieve without triggering systemic collapse. The system by design preserves itself,